in this country. The COVID-19 pandemic is highlighting the absurdity of the $7.25 minimum wage. Many of our essential workers who have been so widely celebrated for their vital service to our communities are still not paid enough to provide for themselves and their families. And as we slowly emerge from this pandemic, we must focus on building back a better economy where workers are paid a fair wage for their work. The Raise the Wage Act will help us achieve that goal in 3 ways. First, it gradually increases the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. Second, it gradually phases out various sub-minimum wages so that tipped workers, youth workers, and workers with disabilities are paid the full federal minimum wage. And third, the bill ensures that the value of the federal minimum wage will not erode over time by tying it with inflation, by tying it to the future increases in the median wages. According to an analysis conducted by the Economic Policy Institute, the Raise the Wage Act will increase the wages for nearly 32 million workers, more than half of whom are what we call essential workers. It would also address racial disparities by raising the wages for roughly 1/3 of all Black workers and 1/4 of all Latino workers. And women workers account for nearly 60% of those who would benefit from this bill. Each time we propose raising the minimum wage, we have the same old set of excuses for why millions of workers must continue to scrape by on poverty level wages. But the policy decisions we make in 2021 can no longer be guided by fear mongering that has undercut workers for decades. As far back as 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed some of these concerns by saying, "Do not let any calamity howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry." Modern research has clearly concluded that raising the federal minimum wage is an effective tool for increasing wages and lifting workers out of poverty while resulting in little to no job loss. The American people have reached a clear consensus on that as well. On state-level ballot initiatives and nationwide polls, Americans across the political spectrum and around the country have repeatedly demonstrated overwhelming support for raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In red states, including Arkansas, Missouri, and most recently Florida, voters have passed minimum wage increases by wide margins. In fact, the support for raising the wage has increased during the pandemic. In 1938, under the shadow of the Great Depression, Congress established a federal minimum wage to increase paychecks for American workers and boost the economy. More than 8 decades later, we must again take that same kind of decisive step to lift millions of workers out of poverty and build an economy where everyone can succeed. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce an early supporter, an early leader in the movement for the $15 minimum wage and the incoming chair of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Bernie Sanders.
Chairman Scott, thank you very much for your introduction, and we thank all of my colleagues who I know have been fighting for this issue for years. Pleasure to be with you all. Look, I don't have to tell anybody, least of all the people on this call, that our country faces major economic crises. Real unemployment today is at 12%, and last month alone, 140,000 workers lost their jobs. Today in America, we are facing massive income and wealth inequality, people on top doing phenomenally well, while ordinary workers all across this country are struggling to feed their kids. And in the midst of all of that, we must never lose sight of the fact that over half of the workers in America today, the richest country in the history of the world, are living paycheck to paycheck. Car breaks down, a medical emergencies, these families suddenly find themselves in terrible financial catastrophe. So let us be clear, and I don't think there's any debate about this. There ain't nobody in America, not in the North, the South, the East, or the West, who can survive on $7.25 an hour federal minimum wage. You can't make it on $9. You can't make it on $12 an hour. And our job as the United States government is to make it clear, and Chairman Scott made this point, and others will make it as well, that in the richest country in the history of the world, if you work 40 hours a week, you should not be living in poverty. Minimum wage must be a living wage, enabling people to live with dignity. It is unacceptable that Congress has not passed an increase in the minimum wage since 2007, 14 years ago. It is a national disgrace that the minimum wage has lost over 30% of its purchasing power since 1968. Yes, now is the time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, at least $15 an hour. And when, as Chairman Scott pointed out, we increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, we will be giving over 32 million Americans a much needed raise all across this country. People are going to work and they're coming home and say, how am I going to feed my families? How am I going to pay the rent? And when we raise that minimum wage to a living wage, we're going to allow people to live with a shred of dignity. And that is what we have got to do. In fact, if the legislation we are introducing today becomes law, the average low-wage worker in America would receive an extra $3,300 each and every year. That is no small thing for a family that is struggling economically. And let us be clear, the overwhelming majority of Americans support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This is not a radical idea. This is what the American people want. And as Chairman Scott pointed out, since 1998, every time a state has had an initiative on the ballot to raise the minimum wage, it has won, no matter if that state was red, blue, or purple. State after state understands that we have got to end starvation wages in America, and that's what we in Congress have got to do as well. In November, just last November, 61% of the people in Florida, a state Joe Biden lost by 3 points, voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. 8 states and over 40 cities have adopted laws to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. During the last session of Congress, the House did the right thing under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Scott, and I applaud them and the entire House for their efforts. And they passed legislation to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and I have no doubt that they will do it once again. Now, at this moment in history, the issue of raising the minimum wage rests in the U.S. Senate. It is my strong hope that a number of my Republican colleagues, many of whom come from terribly poor states, will understand the severity of the crisis facing their working people and joining us, and will join us, in raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This is not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. This is an issue that impacts every working class person in this country. So no matter whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, all of us understand that no one in America can make it on starvation wages. So my hope is we will bring Republicans on board. But we must understand that at this moment, the issue of starvation wages in America is a national emergency. If we cannot get enough Republicans to vote for this legislation under regular order, we cannot simply take no for an answer. We must raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, either through budget reconciliation by a simple majority vote in the Senate. And as the incoming chair of the Senate Budget Committee, that is exactly what I will be fighting to do. And let me remind everybody who thinks that reconciliation is some kind of new or radical concept. Please remember that if the Republicans could use reconciliation to pass trillions of dollars in tax breaks for the wealthy and large corporations, if the Republicans can use the reconciliation process to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, if the Republicans could use reconciliation to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act and throw up to 32 million Americans off of the health care that they have, we can and we must use reconciliation to protect the needs of working families in this country. We must use reconciliation to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now is not the time for excuses. Now is not the time for more talk. Now is the time for action. Millions of families all over this country are looking at us right now, and they are saying, we can't make it on $10 an hour, $12 an hour. Help us do the right thing. And that is exactly what we must do. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Fran Marion. Fran is a 40-year-old parent of two and a McDonald's worker from Kansas City who is currently earning $12.50 an hour. Fran, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It is an honor. Thank you, members of Congress on this call, for inviting me here today and for sponsoring the Raise the Wage Act. As you heard, my name is Fran Marion. I work at McDonald's in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm a leader in the fight for $15 in the union. I'm so proud to join you today for the reintroduction of the Raise the Wage Act. Less than 2 years ago, I had the privilege of sharing my story with many of you in Washington, D.C. On the historic day, the House passed an earlier version of this bill, but we still have some unfinished business. We need to make $15 an hour the law of the land, and the reintroduction of the Raise the Wage Act under a new administration and the 117th Congress fills me with hope. I want everyone to understand the impact the Raise the Wage Act will have on millions of workers like myself. Simply put, $15 an hour will be life-changing. I'm a single mother of two teenagers, Raven and Rashad, and $15 an hour will help us keep a permanent roof over our heads, food on our table, health care, and money to send them to college. And most of all, it'll mean I can look my kids in the eye and tell them that I can give them a life better than mine. This fight for a living wage is not new to me. I joined the fight for $15 in the union 6 years ago when I walked off my own job. And for the first time back then, everyone dismissed our demands as crazy. It wouldn't happen, it non-existent, you know. But we didn't let that stop us. And we continued together over the country and we started winning. We put 42% of US workers on a path to 15. 8 states plus Washington, D.C. have passed $15, including Florida last year, where more than 60% of voters voted for $15 on the same night former President Trump won the state. But still, too many of us, especially Black and brown workers on the front lines of this pandemic, have been left behind and our communities have been devastated. This crisis has revealed too many racial and economic injustices we have faced for generations. Raising the wage to $15 an hour for our communities must be part of our nation's recovery. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 for more than 10 years. It's time to make $15 the floor for all of America. It is the bare minimum workers everywhere of every race need to survive. I want you to hear me and feel what I mean when I say that we cannot keep waiting. And that's why we need our leaders to pass this legislation within the first 100 days of President Biden's administration. My children and the children of tens of millions of workers across our country, we need this. They need this because we are worth more. And again, I thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fran Marion, for being with us today and sharing your experience and pointing out the need for passing the minimum wage, raise the wage to $15 an hour. So thank you very much for being with us today. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce the incoming chair of the Senate Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Senator Patty Murray.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Scott. Friend, thank you so much for sharing your personal story, which is so deeply important to this fight. And I know we're going to hear from a business owner, Mike Draper, as well in just a few minutes. I also want to thank again Representative Scott, Senator Sanders, Representative Jayapal and Murphy for your continued dedication to working families and your efforts to champion the Raise the Wage Act. You know, after years of worsening income inequality, this pandemic has made it painfully clear just how much our economy is benefiting the biggest corporations and wealthiest individuals and failing our workers. Since the beginning of this pandemic, our health and home care workers, our grocery store clerks, our delivery people, our fast food workers, our farmers, our bus drivers, and so many more have kept this country going, showing more clearly than ever before that workers are the backbone of this economy. Democrats and Republicans alike have joined together in rightly calling our essential workers heroes. But despite their tireless work and the risk of COVID exposure, too many of these workers are paid wages so low they cannot afford to pay even their most basic needs. Millions of full-time workers in this country live in poverty or are forced to have 2 or more jobs just to put food on the table and a roof over their head. We've got to be clear-eyed about the reality that because of systemic inequities and discrimination, workers of color, and in particular, women of color, are much more likely to be paid poverty-level wages. This pandemic should be a wake-up call that these workers who are called our heroes deserve more than $7.25 an hour. Democrats are asking for $15 an hour because no one working a 40-hour week should be making $15,000 a year. That's why we are introducing the Raise the Wage Act today, one of the first acts of this new Democratic Congress. This legislation will give 32 million people a raise, including 31% of Black workers and 26% of Latino workers. 59% of working women will finally get a raise, helping them make ends meet and support their families. This bill will also end the tipped sub-minimum wage and provide economic security to restaurant workers and others. This is especially important given that most tip workers are women, and given that women of color make up a disproportionate amount of tipped workers. This only further exacerbates racial inequities in our economy. These workers are facing increased levels of harassment and exposure to the coronavirus during this pandemic, but still making wages as low as $2.13 an hour plus tips. And this bill will finally end the sub-minimum wage for workers with disabilities, a policy that is discrimination, plain and simple. It is unconscionable that in this country, it is still legal to pay people with disabilities pennies on the dollar, simply because they have a disability. If we are committed to an economy that works for everyone, we need one fair, livable wage for everyone. We won't accept carve-outs, and we won't accept leaving anyone behind. We need to do more than tweet our accolades or introduce resolutions. It is time we thank our frontline workers by ensuring their right to a livable wage and pass this legislation. So any of my colleagues who agree that $15,000 a year is not enough to live on should support this bill. But let's be clear, giving millions of workers a sorely needed and much deserved raise is just one of many steps we have got to take to move towards an economy that benefits all of us, from fair wages to keeping workers safe and free from harassment to protecting their right to organize. With the Biden administration and a Democratic Congress, I will do everything I can to advance policies that support workers and working families. Thank you. And with that, I have the great honor to introduce my great friend and partner from Washington State, who stands up for our working families every single day, Congresswoman Jayapal. Great to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Senator Murray, my United States Senator, for your work and representing our state so powerfully. And thank you, Fran, for stating so clearly what is at stake here. Also, Chairman Scott, you have been a tremendous leader for us in the House, and my friend, Senator Sanders, you have been at the forefront of this fight for raising the wage and so many other policies that benefit working people. This legislation is near and dear to my heart. For decades before coming to Congress, I was an organizer for immigrant and civil rights and for economic justice, organizing alongside labor unions and working people of all races, fighting for a minimum wage that is a living wage. And thanks to the power of strong unions and community organizations, our state, Washington State, was the first state in the country to tie minimum wage to inflation. And thanks to the courage of fast food workers like Fran, who began in late 2012, walking out on their jobs to protest their low wages, a movement spiraled throughout the country, including in my home city of Seattle. In January of 2014, I served on the Mayor's Income and Equality Committee, made up of labor, high road businesses, and community activists. And together we drafted the details of Seattle's $15 minimum wage proposal. Just months later, it passed, making my home city of Seattle the first major city in the country to enact a $15 minimum wage. Now, we heard a lot of hand wringing then, just as we did when we passed the Raise the Wage Act in the House of Representatives, about all the terrible things that would happen if you passed an increase to the minimum wage. What actually happened in Seattle in the years that followed? We had stronger businesses, healthier families and communities, and a growing economy. In 2019, Forbes ranked us as the #1 place for businesses and careers. Our economy grew at 3 times the rate of the median US city. We had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And just yesterday, recognizing what workers on the front lines are doing for all of us, the Seattle City Council also unanimously passed a $4 crisis hazard pay increase for grocery store workers and larger chains to acknowledge the risk and the contributions of frontline workers who have kept our communities going through this pandemic. We are a city that has learned that when we work hard to take care of the workers who take care of us, it is good for all of us. Following Seattle, voters in Washington State raised the state minimum wage in 2016, and going into 2021, 20 Republican and Democratic states have now raised their minimum wage. But the city and the state that you live in should not determine whether or not you can make a living wage. Every worker in America should be able to make a living wage. The federal minimum wage, as you've heard, has not been increased in a decade. A big part, but not the only thing, that is responsible for that growing income and wealth inequality in America. Millions of people are still working full-time, still living in poverty, even as the rich get richer in the midst of a pandemic. Our current federal minimum wage is a disgrace. $7.25 an hour means just $15,000 a year. How can you feed your family or pay rent or even think about having just a bit of savings for an emergency? And today, in the midst of multiple crises that face our country, it is a moral imperative that we raise the federal minimum wage immediately. Last session, the People's House with Chairman Scott and Speaker Pelosi in the leadership passed the Raise the Wage Act, and we're ready to do it again. And now we have a president, Biden, who believes that we should pass a $15 minimum wage, and a Senate led by Democrats ready to work for the people. So let's get to work and let's help tens of millions of Americans have hope for a better life by raising the federal minimum wage. And now it's my honor to turn things over to my colleague and a champion for raising the federal minimum wage, who comes from that state of Florida, who just passed an increase to the minimum wage, my friend, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Jayapal. And it's such an honor to be on this call with you and the chair, Chairman Scott, as well as our colleagues on in the other chamber, the senators. As many of you may know, I wasn't blessed to be an American citizen. I was born in Vietnam, and when I was just a baby, we fled Vietnam by boat and were rescued by the US Navy and given refuge in this country. And my family, we were eternally grateful to be here. But life wasn't always easy. My mom worked as a seamstress and my dad at a power plant. And together they cleaned office buildings at night, sometimes bringing my brother and I with them. My parents didn't speak English well or have a community of close friends. But what they did have, like so many other immigrants, was a really strong work ethic. My dad also had a labor union in his corner. The union spoke for him and it fought for him. And my parents worked so hard so that their children would have opportunities that they themselves never had. And that's the American dream. If you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to succeed in this country and make a better life for your kids. But it takes real effort to keep that dream alive. And right now, too many working families are struggling to make ends meet, especially during this terrible pandemic. And one reason is that for more than a decade, the federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour, while the cost of living has skyrocketed. And there's no part of this great nation where $7.25 is even close to living wage anymore. It's certainly not a living wage in my Orlando district, which has both a high cost of living, especially when it comes to housing, and the lowest median income of the 50 largest cities in the country. Last Congress, when we passed the Raise the Wage Act in the House, I said this would not be the end of the story. And I said we would take this fight to the Senate and to the states, and that's exactly what we did. When the Senate refused to act on the bill, we didn't give up. We kept working. And now my home state of Florida, a state that supported the Republican candidate for president this past election, also voted to raise the state minimum wage to $15 an hour. And that's because this isn't a Republican or a Democratic issue. Florida voters across the political spectrum understand it's way past time that we give hardworking Americans a raise. They've earned it. And now it's impossible to deny that these are really hard times. But if we give workers a raise, they'll have more money to spend in the local economy because workers are consumers too. Everybody around here knows that I'm a fiscally responsible member of Congress. And at a time when our nation's debt has reached a troubling level, this bill will ensure fewer Americans have to rely on our government to support themselves and their families. And I think that there should be bipartisan support for that. So don't let anyone mislead you in telling you that raising the minimum wage is bad for our economy or bad for working families. At the end of the day, my reasoning for supporting this bill has not changed. In the greatest country on earth, nobody with the dignity of a full-time job should suffer the indignity of not being able to provide for themselves or their loved ones. So thank you for having me with you today. And now I'd like to introduce you to Mike Draper. Mike is the owner of Ray Gun Clothing and Home Goods, and they have grown from Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, to Kansas City, to Chicago, and most recently, Omaha. With that, I'll yield you the floor.
Hello. I am speaking to you from our closet. We have to wear masks throughout the store, so this is the only place that's a closed room that I can talk from. So sorry that I can't brag about all the books I've been reading. My name is Mike Draper. I own Raygun, which is a member of Business for a Fair Minimum Wage. We actually printed Fran's shirt. Thank you, Fran. I am currently sitting about 6 blocks from where I was born in Des Moines, so geographically I have not come very far in life. I started advocating for the minimum wage back in 2014 when it was only at $7.25 an hour. And then I kept advocating in 2019 when it had moved to $7.25 an hour, and here I am in 2021 and it is still $7.25 an hour. Over the course of that time, we have raised our wages from about $9 an hour to an equivalent of 13 in most of our stores, 17 in Chicago, where the minimum wage is currently, I think, 14. So we're already on track to be at 15 in about a year and a half. And while our starting wage has gone up about $4 an hour, in that same time period, our cost of goods, cost of a shirt has gone up about $1. And that's a mix of many things, labor, but also cost of goods. Paying people fairly leads to greater staff retention. It reduces the need for, the cost of hiring, retraining, and it also leads to a better community in general. I think a lot of companies are seeing the benefits, and that big ones like Amazon, Costco, Target are already at or moving to $15 an hour. So this is a trend that is already happening in some segments. Now, somebody may ask, all right, so isn't paying higher wages just your decision? If you and Target want to raise your wages, that's good, but why do we need a higher minimum wage? Wages are rising for some, but now the minimum wage is turning into this artificially low wage loophole that's being exploited. These artificially low wages not only cost businesses like mine in the form of government assistance to employees who are working at this wage, but it costs businesses like mine in terms of reduced spending power in a community. As a country that comes out of a pandemic into a recession and risks a stalled recovery, we need as much money in as many hands as possible. Raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025 will be a boost to the economy and a boost to our sales and everyone else's sales. Now, I'm obviously a free marketer, but if the free market doesn't mean free of rules, it's deciding the rules that we all operate by in those parameters. And this is a long overdue raising of just what the wage floor is. It will be good for sales. It will be good for business. It will be good for the country. This is overdue. I can't believe I'm still here advocating to just move it up, and it has been frozen in time. This could be the most consequential and helpful economic relief that America has seen in a decade. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Senator Sanders, Fran Marion, Senator Murray, Representative Jayapal, Representative Murphy, and Mike Draper. And thank you, Mike, for your comments. I want to thank all of you for your leadership and working to make the case to raise the wage to $15 an hour. That concludes the speaking part of the program. Now, if the reporters have any questions, please click the raise hand button, which can be found by clicking participants, and raise hand will be at the bottom of the participants list. We'll take as many questions as we can. If you're asking a question, please let us know which member your question is directed to and your outlet, so we can get to as many questions as possible. And the moderator will now begin to call on reporters. Josh?
Thank you. Our first question comes from Jeff Stein of the Washington Post.
Hey guys, thanks everyone, especially Fran and Mike, for hopping on the call. This is a question for either Senator Murray or Senator Sanders. As you know, there are about, I think, 11 Senate Democrats who still have not signed on to raise the Wage Act. Could you talk about your efforts in the last few days to, get Senate Democrats to fully come on board and unify around this proposal? Are those conversations happening? Are those efforts ongoing? Anything you could say about that push would be much appreciated.
Bernie, you're on mute.
There we go. All right. Jeff, I look at it from a different perspective. I think the good news is we have 38 members of the United States Senate who are supportive. And for, people sometimes do not co-sponsor legislation for a variety of reasons, which does not mean they're not going to support it. At the end of the day, if your question is, do I think we have 50 votes plus one to pass a $15 an hour minimum wage? I absolutely believe that we do.
Our next question comes from Elon Moy of CNBC.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. My question is for Senator Sanders. Can you talk a little bit about how you would plan to structure any increase in the minimum wage so that it could be passed through budget reconciliation? Do you think that it needs to be approached as a tax on companies that don't pay a $15 minimum wage, or do you think that it could pass muster with the parliamentarian as is? If you could talk a little bit about structure of how you.
Yeah, we're working on that. Thank you for that good question. We're working on that right now. But here is the bottom line, and I think Representative Murphy made the point a little while ago. We think that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour will mean that a whole lot of workers now who are receiving one form of public assistance or another will no longer have to be in that position. They'll be better able to stand on their own 2 feet and not need that public assistance, which means it will have a very positive impact on the federal deficit. So that, I think, is one of the major arguments that we will be making.
Our next question comes from Liz Landers of Vice.
Hi, this question is for Senator Sanders as well. Senator, I know you have been an advocate for the $15 minimum wage for years, really since 2016, when you first ran for president. This is going to be a gradual raise, and so it won't hit 15 until 2025, if I'm understanding this. Do you think that $15 minimum wage is going to be enough in 2025?
You know, left alone, if I were the dictator of the world, I would go further, to be honest with you. I mean, you're right, Liz. We talked about this way back in 2016. And as Pramila mentioned, the state of Washington passed this a number of years ago. And every year, inflation eats into the purchasing power of the minimum wage. But we are where we are right now. So while I personally would go further, I think $15 an hour over a period of 4 years will improve life substantially for millions and millions of workers. And I'm going to do everything I can to see that that occurs.
Great. Our next question comes from Politico.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you so much for hosting this call. So I have 2 questions. Firstly, for Senator Sanders, do you have any concerns about using reconciliation and running afoul of the Byrd Rule regarding, a $15 minimum wage? And then my second question for Rep. Murphy would just be, how does the Blue Dog Coalition feel about this effort? I know there were some concerns last time when the House brought this bill to the floor.
Let me go first, and then we'll get over to the Congresswoman. Look, frankly, I would be more than happy if 10 Republicans announced today that they understand that workers in their own states can't make it on $8 or $9 an hour, that we have to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That would be great. But between you and me, I don't think that that is going to happen. And as I mentioned earlier, this idea of reconciliation is not a new idea. It's not a radical concept. It has been used before. And if my Republican friends can justify using reconciliation to give almost $2 trillion in tax breaks to the richest people in this country and to large corporations, if they can use it, could use it, to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act and throw over 30 million Americans off the health care they have, if they could use it to get drilling in the Arctic National Wilderness, you know what? We can use reconciliation process to protect working families who are struggling today in a way that they have not since the Great Depression. So I think we absolutely can make the case to the parliamentarian that what we're doing is consistent with the Byrd Rule and that it should pass muster.
Our next question comes from Haley Talbot of NBC.
Sorry, I think you just answered. I was just going to ask if you plan to do budget reconciliation on the floor next week and if this is part of it.
I think the budget resolution will be up next week.
Our next question comes from Makini Bryce from Reuters.
Hi, I'm sorry if this is a really obvious question. I just started the beat, but I just want to check if the introduction of this bill, if this indicates that this is something the Democrats would be willing to go ahead on without waiting for the entire coronavirus stimulus package proposed by the Biden administration.
This is Bobby Scott. We're going to proceed as a separate bill, but we will take every opportunity to pass the bill in the House.
Great. Our next question comes from Niv Ellis of The Hill.
Hi, yeah, thanks for doing this. So I'm going to drill down on this so hard with the bird rule. Most of the experts on the bird rule have been saying that because this minimum wage would be incidental to any budgetary increases, that they don't think that it could pass muster. So can you just talk a little bit more about what kind of strategies you have or what ways you might reshape the policy in order to get it to pass muster? Elon mentioned that the idea of doing it as a tax on companies that don't have that minimum wage?
No, we don't accept those arguments. Yeah, some people have made it, other people have rejected those arguments and feel that this is absolutely consistent with the rules of reconciliation. I would point out to you that there have been a number of studies, one by Economic Policy Institute, one by University of California at Berkeley, that make the point that there will be a substantial savings in taxpayer dollars when we raise the minimum wage. So we think we are on very safe grounds. We think we're going to win the argument with the parliamentarian.
Sir, but just to follow up, the CBO scored the Raise the Wage Act when it was passed last year in the House, and it said that there were minimal budgetary impacts. So what do you make of that, that it's already gone through the CBO?
Well, we talked to the CBO just the other day, and they did not consider, I think, the broad implications of what raising the minimum wage would be. They looked at it rather narrowly. But the bottom line, and I think common sense makes this point, if millions of workers receive a pay increase, there will be less dependency on public assistance, which will have a significant impact on the deficit, which means that it should be considered as part of reconciliation.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Eleanor Muller from Politico.
Hi there, and thank you so much for making this call happen today. My question is for whomever wants to take it, but pretty straightforward. I mean, you said, Chair Scott, that you want to pursue the bill separately, outside of any other efforts to get it cleared. Do we have any kind of timeline for when we could see it on the floor?
It would be early in the session. We're in organizational phase now. As chair of the committee, I don't have all of the committee members. Next step would be to organize the committees. So we're in organizational efforts right now. I think we may be able to bring it to the floor without going through committee, since it's already been through committee in the last Congress. So we're going to move it as quickly as we can. Everybody understands the issue, and it's already passed the House. A lot of the same members will be voting on it again. So as quickly as we can, but we're just getting organized right now, so things are a lot slower than I would like, but that's just what happens at the beginning of a session.
Thank you, Chairman.
And we have time for one last question, and we'll go to John Steingart from Law 360.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. My question is for Chairman Scott. I noticed that this bill differs from the one that the House passed last year in that it drops the requirement for GAO to report on minimum wage in the Northern Mariana Islands, which is treated differently under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I was wondering if the territory is something that you plan to address.
I'm sure we will. We tried to keep it as close to the bill that we passed as possible. So that was not, we didn't take, that was not a, that wasn't a big deal in the bill. We wanted as close to the bill that we passed as possible.
Well, if that's the case, the bill, it's in the bill that you passed, so
Yeah,
you
so
eliminated it.
I'll look at that. And I'm sure Mr. Sablon will make sure it's back in there.
Thank you.
Great, and Chairman Scott, you'll feel free to wrap the call up.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of our reporters for being with us. I want to thank Senator Sanders, Fran Marion, Senator Murray, Representative Jayapal, Representative Murphy, Mike Draper, and all of the reporters for being with us today. And we look forward to the passage of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. As it's been indicated, every time it's been on the ballot, it's passed. And in Florida, as Representative Murphy said, as they were voting for the Republican nominee for president, they were passing the minimum wage, and it wasn't close. It was over 60%. So it won by more than 20 points. Similar margin in Arkansas and Missouri. So we're very optimistic and look forward to its passage so that people can make a livable wage and be able to meet their needs. As I indicated in my opening remarks, a study showed that a full-time minimum wage worker today cannot afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment in any county in the United States, not just Manhattan and downtown San Francisco, no county in the United States. And everybody knows that's not right. So we're going to fix that when we pass the minimum wage. So thank you very much. And that concludes the press conference.